No, Dr. Michael Armin here again, and Bernard the Barrister Bear. Say hello, Bernard. Hello! This is another video on the Coronation, this time about the internal conflict between Protestantism and inclusiveness. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. Well, Bernard has there quoted a well-known passage from Shakespeare's Hamlet, where protest doesn't mean opposition, but just means insistence, which is an old-fashioned meaning of the word. And we have something of that here in the Coronation, because there's a great insistence on Protestantism, and yet at the same time an insistence on all-inclusiveness. Which one is the real King Charles? Because back in 1994, as Prince of Wales, King Charles said that when he was crowned, he would like to be crowned as defender of faith rather than defender of the faith, to indicate that he would defend all faiths. Well, there was quite a fuss about it, and just over 20 years later, in 2015, he recanted somewhat and said, well, no, I'm happy to be crowned as defender of the faith, as long as it's understood to be all-inclusive. Well, the thing is, the title was actually granted to Henry VIII originally in 1521 by the Pope to indicate Henry VIII's loyalty to Catholicism. Henry VIII was a bit of a amateur theologian, and he had actually written a theological treatise attacking Martin Luther and the Reformation. That's why he was given the title, defender of the faith, being the Roman Catholic faith. But some years later, when he himself wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, which the Pope wouldn't grant him, he himself became a Protestant, and of course the Pope then stripped him, a different Pope, stripped him of that title. But it was rather cheekily given back to him by Parliament a few years later. Defender of the faith, now meaning defender of the Anglican faith. You can see it on all coins. Every coin has that title, in Latin, Fidei Defensor, usually abbreviated FID, and then DEF, Fid Def, Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. Pointed in Latin, there is no word for the. So strictly speaking, I suppose, you could translate Fidei Defensor as defender of the faith, or equally as defender of faith. But in English, it's always defender of the faith. And that was used at the coronation of King Charles, as it had been in previous coronations. Not only that, but he actually had a major oath, which he swore that he was a faithful Protestant. Faithful Protestant. And, I mean, several verbs there. I do solemnly and sincerely in the presence of God profess, testify, and declare that I am a faithful Protestant, and that I will secure the Protestant succession to the throne. Gosh, and what is that? Well, what it means is that Roman Catholics are debarred from being kings or queens of England, of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And that has been the case since 1689. Charles himself wouldn't be king if it weren't for the fact that there is a Protestant succession, that James II was thrown out in 1689 because he was a Catholic, among other reasons, and there was, from 1714, they had a major search to find the nearest Protestant relation, and they gave the succession to King George I and his successors. Charles is a direct heir, direct descendant of George I. So if it weren't for the Protestant succession, he wouldn't be there. Why this insistence on the Protestant succession and Protestantism? Well, because back in the 17th century, any king, any Catholic king would be suspected of being allied to Catholic rulers on the continent, in France, Spain, and Austria in particular. Well, is that still a problem today? Not at all. So why this continued insistence on the Protestant succession? Well, that's a tradition. Is it a tradition worth keeping up? Up to Parliament, really, to decide that. But it still remains the case that King of England, King of the United Kingdom, has to be a Protestant, or Queen of the United Kingdom has to be a Protestant. But at the same time, Charles is insistent on being all-inclusive, and this time, for the first time, even the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, participated in the coronation service, actually pronouncing a blessing over King Charles. But, stand up the real King Charles. It's a tricky one. What about the protesters outside? Yeah, well, Bernard reminds me that, of course, there's a different type of protest, not Protestant, but protestor. But there were a few protests that were launched in London and all around the country, also in Scotland, against the monarchy, some with placards saying, "Not my king," others calling for an elected head of state, and so on. Apparently 64 were arrested by the police, and the police said that they had found some lock-on devices intended to enable protesters, demonstrators, to attach themselves to railings and so on, possible disruption. They denied it, saying that those were just straps to keep their signs in place. Well, I don't know, of course. But certainly you must have the right to protest. You have the right to demonstrate. It's all part of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But it must never disrupt the rights of others. As always, whenever one person claims a right, there are rights on the other side. So the rights of protesters, yes, certainly they have that right, as long as it doesn't cause disruption and therefore affects the rights of others. They say, those protesters who were arrested at the coronation say that they were not planning disruption. Of course, I don't know. They may be right. But the police weren't taking any chances. Perhaps a more interesting aspect of the protest is the idea, the proposal on the part of some of these protesters to replace the monarchy with an elected head of state. But the problem with an elected head of state is that usually that person is going to be a political leader, as for example is the United States President. The Irish President is an exception, but he is or she is directly elected, but there is a Prime Minister in place there as well. Very unusual situation. Usually when a president or head of state is elected by the people at large, that gives them tremendous political power, and usually they are politicians. They can become dictators that way. In republics, though, most republics, for that same reason, the head of state is not elected, but is very much like the British monarch, apolitical, or is meant to be apolitical, outside politics, and is actually appointed usually by the Parliament or one House of Parliament in that country. And but these people are very often retired politicians, so they do have political views. And even if they're not retired politicians, if they're retired judges or retired clergy or just some sort of supposed celebrity, they are very likely, they will have their own political views, which may or may not come out. They may try to impose those in one way or another, depending on the powers granted to them, of course. Whereas here in Britain, now, I would say at least for the past century or so, the monarchy has been trained to be neutral in politics. Whatever views the king or queen may have privately are not expressed and certainly not acted upon. It's taken a long time to get there, but I think it's probably a good thing to have a head of state who is not politically involved and represents the country, is not divisive therefore. Of course, the monarchy is divisive in the sense that there are those who are against it, but other than that, it's not divisive in the sense of taking sides politically. So I think one has to think very hard about replacing it, because the question is, yes, it seems wrong to have a hereditary monarchy in some ways, but is there a better alternative? More next time. Bye.